Photography was an extremely popular medium in the United States during the span of years between the Great Depression and World War II. Documentary photography, a central branch of this medium, reflected the public's enormous interest in everyday life and its belief that photographs represented reality. However, different uses of widely distributed images had also exposed them to different, sometimes even opposing, meanings and interpretations. The purpose of this paper is to examine the different uses and changing meanings of RA and FSA photographs in American newspapers and magazines during the 1930s and 1940s. The Resettlement Administration, RA, that was turned into the Farm Security Administration, FSA, 2 years after its foundation in 1935, were agencies involved in the efforts of the New Deal to solve the crisis in American agriculture. According to David Eldridge, with radical plans to remove poor farmers from unproductive land and resettle them in new government housing cooperatives, build utopian suburbs for refugees from the shattered industrial cities, and provide shelters for thousands of migrant families in government labor camps, the RA was probably the most controversial of the New Deal's agencies." End quote. As such, it encountered strong conservative opposition and was always at risk of being shut down. The RA Photographic Agency also started in 1935 by a small team of photographers working under the devoted management of Roy Stryker, an economist who had deep faith in the potential of photographs to instruct and persuade the public. The RAFSA photographers documented the agriculture and farming conditions throughout the country. This included, for example, images of the victims of dust storms, drought, and floods, many of whom migrated westward in search of temporary work, and images of tenants and sharecroppers who were dismissed by landowners due to both the economic crisis and to the increasing mechanization of American agriculture. The agricultural crisis did not begin with the Great Depression, but the deterioration of agricultural conditions due to the economic crisis further dislocated small farmers, tenants, and sharecroppers, making them the most deprived of the poor population of the United States. However, this condition also represented the approaching end of the American agricultural era, and as such, it marked a significant cultural crisis for a nation whose roots and heritage were grounded in agriculture and the land. RAFSA images were intended to influence legislation and promote the public approval of congressional allocations aimed at assisting agricultural workers and their families. This would be accomplished by generating awareness and empathy to their plight with images such as these, as well as images of the government's aid to them. During the first 2 years of the agency's existence, RAFSA photographs emphasized human suffering and government aid. But in 1937, Stryker expanded the purpose of the project to include what Beverly Brannan and Carl Fleischhauer describe as a pictorial record of America. Central to this record was the American small town, that for many Americans represented an obsolete ideal world at a time when the country had undergone a great shift from a rural agrarian society to an urban industrial one. This change in the goals and character of the FSA images continued into the following decade against the background of World War II and the joining of the US to the Allied forces in 1941. The content of these photographs now also emphasized the uniqueness of places and landscapes, and agricultural workers became pictorial representatives of a pastoral rural life. This change is illustrated in a known citation of Stryker in a letter written in the autumn of 1940 and directed to FSA photographer Jack Delano. Emphasized the idea of abundance, the horn of plenty, and poor maple syrup over it. You know, mix well with white clouds and put on a sky blue platter. End quote. In 1942, the FSA was merged with the OWI, the Office of War Information. The role of its photographers was now to document urban and industrial subjects and images of daily life in the suburbs. In an optimistic and patriotic spirit, under Stryker's new instructions, these images presented families, children, and positive aspects of community life and employment, with an emphasis on the war industries. The FSA photographs were widely publicized throughout the United States, thanks to Stryker's efforts. They appeared in exhibitions, books, newspapers, magazines, and other publications. Made by talented photographers who emphasized the humanity of the subjects, some of the best well-known of these photographs have shaped the national memory of the Great Depression, to quote John Reber. Nevertheless, different uses of FSA images also endowed them with different meanings. This file was capable of 100 interpretations, as one of the prominent photographers in Stryker's team noted. The 1930s and 1940s also marked the zenith of popular photographic magazines in the United States. The RA Photographic Project originated about 1 year before the appearance of Live magazine in 1936. According to Warren Sussman, this magazine can perhaps be credited with the invention of the picture essay, a mass communication medium that achieved enormous popularity among middle-class audiences. However, documentary images of the Depression were not very conspicuous in popular magazines such as Life, Look, or Fortune, and they certainly did not represent progressive social ideas. Even in those decades, to quote James Gimmond, Life magazine always had room for good news about the nation's economy and prosperity, all illustrated with pictures of satisfied consumers, happy families, grinning young people, and smiling workers. End quote. This characteristic reflects Stryker's recurrent failure to convince Life's editors to publish FSA images of rural poverty. Eventually, he remarked, "We had best give up the idea of getting pictures into Life. That is, any picture that have any guts to them." Images and captions introducing focal essays on the cover of Look magazine for March 1937 also demonstrate this denial of human suffering. The cover presents subjects such as scientific progress, movies, and movie stars. FSA image of mother and child appear on this cover too, representatives of the forgotten men. The term coined by Roosevelt to define poor agricultural workers. Exceptional among these feel-good and glamour images and words, this photograph can be easily forgotten. In spite of Stryker abandoning the idea of cooperation with Life, the magazine did eventually publish a photo essay on the Depression with an FSA image. It was one photograph out of 25 sent by Dorothea Lange and others of her works sent by Stryker after an argument they had about which images should be used by the magazine. Lange objected to Stryker's intention to send images she had designated for the FSA's annual report to the Senate. Ultimately, she promised him to create a series for Life consisting of images of different effects, as she described them, that would present a more dramatic and more moving story. Lange's protest, suggesting the sensational and shallow character of popular photo essays, was not uncommon among photographers, critics and intellectuals of the time. FSA photographer Russell Lee, for instance, called Life a magazine that favored lousy, crappy stuff. Photographer and FSA visual designer Edwin Roskam disapproved of what he called the flashy layout technique of magazines. Art and photography critic Elizabeth McCausland argued that the opportunities for publishing honest photographs of present-day life in magazines or newspapers are not many. Poet Archibald MacLeish argued that the editors of Life did not recognize that the problem of integrating image and text is artistic, not journalistic. The only journalist MacLeish considered innovative in his use of photographs and words was James Agee. In the spring of 1936, Agee worked together with RA photographer Walker Evans on a photo essay for Fortune magazine. In his words, he was asked to prepare an article on cotton tenantry in the United States in the form of a photographic and verbal record of the daily living and environment of an average white family of tenant farmers. End quote. This essay, conducted in Hale County, Alabama, was ready after 2 months of intensive work, but did not fit in with Fortune's optimistic character and therefore was rejected. Agee summed up the issue by saying that his story was too subversive for the magazine. Eventually, he expanded it into a 471-page critical photo book with 31 photographs by Evans, published 5 years later. In this book, called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, Agee defined journalism as a broad and successful form of lying. By the early 40s, however, Agee and Evans' book had become a bitter commercial failure, while the popular magazines infiltrated the homes of millions. Stryker also distinguished his photographers' works from news photographs. News pictures are the noun and the verb, he wrote retrospectively. Our kind of photography is the adjective and adverb. The news picture is a single frame, ours a subject viewed in series. The news picture is dramatic, all subject and action. Ours show what's back of the action. It is a broader statement. End quote. Nevertheless, Stryker's intensive and ambitious distribution of RA-FSA photographs exposed them to varied and sometimes opposing manipulations of their meanings. Unlike the RA-FSA exhibits, he had less control over the presentation of images in the popular press. He had also made what Nancy West defined as troubling compromises regarding such presentations. In some cases, images were bluntly cropped, recombined, and accompanied with words in ways that contradicted the social purpose for which they were originally made. From Roland Barthes in the 1960s to Alan Sekula, John Tagg, W.J.T. Mitchell, Linda Nochlin, and others in later decades, critics referred to the influence of words on their interpretation of the photographic image and to the cultural connotations embodied in the image itself. Barthes, for instance, argued that the structure of the photograph is not an isolated structure. It is in communication with at least one other structure, namely the text, title, caption, or article. According to Sekula, a photographic discourse is a system within which the culture harnesses photographs to various representational tasks. End quote. Different ways in which RA-FSA images were used in the popular press gave rise to different, sometimes contradictory, cultural connotations. Perhaps the most conspicuous way in which these images were presented was the paradoxical merging of wretchedness and nobility. RA-FSA images of poor agricultural workers and their families were often described, for example, in words such as despairing, broke, or misery. On other occasions, the legends of their images included words and terms such as promised land, pioneers, and strong faith, with their connotations of the individualistic, self-made, independent farmer's heritage. In the photo essay in Life magazine mentioned earlier, Lang's image of a man she described as an ex-tenant farmer on relief grant in the Imperial Valley, California, ironically became a new pioneer. The ambivalence of these presentations reflects two conflicting trends characteristic of American culture during the Depression and the New Deal, both related to the image of the poor agricultural worker. On the one hand, there was an awakening of negative stereotypes of the poor, while the perception that poverty is related to environmental causes had been prevalent since the end of the 19th century. The traditional prejudice against poor people as lazy and dishonest or biologically inferior was even reinforced during the Depression. Conversely, there was a significant revival of what Terry Cooney defined as the American endurance theme, which drew on the agrarian myth. According to this theme, as he claims, Americans were a people who could take it and persevere. End quote. The agrarian myth was rooted in American pioneering history. According to this myth, to quote Sidney Baldwin, a mystical quality attached to land and its cultivation. The farmer was the elect of God, a priest entrusted with the care of the earth. Referring to this image, Charles Cunningham summarizes that poor agricultural workers were sometimes presented in Life magazine as new pioneers, the cause of their poverty due to their being victims of nature and geography, and sometimes as white trash, ridiculous and lacking intelligence. However, he comments, in all Life's representations of white, rural poverty, capitalism itself is never implicated or even considered as a causal factor. End quote. Such presentations indeed distracted public attention from the central reason for rural poverty and from the exploitations of the American agricultural system. The latter was based on a hierarchy of a few big landowners, a larger number of small farmers, many of whom had lost their land in the Depression, and a host of tenants and sharecroppers, many of whom became day laborers or unemployed. In Look magazine, poor agricultural workers appeared, when they were not forgotten, as exotic others or as curiosities. To quote Wendy Kozel, this rhetoric thus depicted the photographed people in a way that probably made most readers aware that their own lives were very different and their conditions infinitely better. This physical and cultural difference is illustrated by viewers' responses to a focal exhibit of FSA Photographs in the Grand Central Palace, New York, in April 1938. The subjects of the photographs were referred to in such terms as these people, the other half, or the underprivileged. FSA images of blacks who had no share in the national pioneering heritage and the agrarian myth did not appear frequently in the popular press. Even when blacks were referred in words, images were in most cases of white rural poor. When FSA images of blacks were presented in popular magazines, it was in a manner that typically elided, as Kozel wrote, the historical specificity of the racism embedded in the tenancy system. Moreover, such presentations strengthened traditional racist perceptions of blacks as lazy and passive. Nicholas Nathanson exemplifies this with an image taken by Ben Shahn of black unemployed from Louisiana. Of the FSA black faces that were seen in the general press, in Nathanson's words, this image was most frequently tabbed in the early years. It is important to note, however, that even though FSA images of blacks were rarely presented in the popular press, the file itself contained many such images, most of them extremely respectful. This image, also exceptional among Shahn's works, is closer in character to the melodramatic images of the successful journalist-photographer Margaret Bourke-White, in which black agricultural workers were presented as lazy, indifferent, or helpless. Like the FSA photographic file following the change in national climate during the war years, the use of FSA images in the popular press had shifted their focus. They now conveyed positive messages praising America. Thus, the written text increasingly removed the subjects from the removed their subjects from the context of rural poverty, transforming them into representations of pastoral rural life and of idealized life in the American small town. Connotations to the pioneering ethos were strengthened even more in this period. This change was also conducive to a sharp increase in the use of FSA images in popular magazines. According to Carl Flanagan, as compared to 9,065 IRA images published in the second half of 1935, a distribution of almost 1,500 FSA images per month was reported in leading popular magazines for 1940. I conclude with an example of this tendency in the use of FSA photographs in the early 1940s, a photo essay published in the popular magazine US Camera in October 1941. The title of FSA photographer Russell Lee's essay was Pie Town, Life on the American Frontier. The reference to the frontier myth, closely related with the agrarian myth, is clear, and it is also prominent in the essay itself. Lee's images and words also praise American democracy, emphasizing issues such as working life, community, unity, and cooperation in Pie Town, New Mexico, as substitutes, in his words, for machine guns and Gestapo. Against the background of the US joining to the Allied forces, thus, images of poor rural population had now mutated into an astonishing record of the great American qualities that created this country, to quote Lee. The Pie Town photo essay, like many other sentimentally patriotic, upbeat photo essays, clearly suggests that rural poverty, which had not disappeared even if it was somewhat relived, had become yesterday's news in the popular press by 1941. Agri described it in the same year in his and Evans' critical documentary photo book I mentioned earlier. Now that we are busy battering ourselves as the last stronghold of democracy, he writes, interest in such embarrassments has tactfully slackened off. תודה.